What if the entire Gotham City police force turned their backs on Batman and Robin?
Peak fiction incoming.
The second issue of Matt Fraction and Jorge Jimenez's new Batman series is finally out on shelves, and today we're gonna break down the entire thing from start to finish. Okay, so if you guys don't remember, the last issue consisted of Killer Croc escaping Arkham Towers and causing havoc on the streets of Gotham because he regressed into a childlike state of mind and pretty much just didn't know any better. So after consulting Croc's doctor, Batman strapped himself inside the Batmobile's cockpit and began searching the city far and wide to pinpoint the location of this baby-like monster. But unsurprisingly, he'd run into some trouble in the process of doing so, discovering two young girls at Robinson Park in the midst of being swarmed by a new street gang that called themselves the Creeps. So he interrupted their little act of cruelty before things could escalate even further by ramming his Batmobile into a bunch of members that were huddled up next to each other before getting out of the Batmobile himself just moments later and neutralizing the gang's leader. Knowing that he still had work to do though, he'd then walk over to Gotham's Natural History Museum and assume that that was where Killer Croc was hiding upon discovering a bunch of animal guts laid out on the floor. And at first he was under the impression that he'd be dealing with the situation with his fists like he was used to because he was still pretty skeptical about Croc being childlike and harmless. But it turned out that his doctor was right because rather than trying to attack him, Croc just sat there on the floor astonished by the museum's giant T-Rex display. So Bruce depowered his electro-charged bat gauntlets and decided to just sit there and talk with him until the doctors from Arkham arrived to transfer Croc back to the towers. However, once things settled down and Bruce arrived back home, what seemed like a peaceful night quickly turned into quite the opposite when none other than Tim Drake chimed in on the emergency frequency, asking Bruce if there were any cops they were cool with nowadays because he was currently being held at gunpoint by two of the city's officers after stopping a thief stealing cargo from a box truck. This issue, on the other hand, picks up in the past at Wayne Manor, with Damian unwillingly and irritatingly washing one of the Batmobiles as Alfred observed nearby while enjoying a nice cup of tea. But the focus wasn't on Damian that day, the focus was on Tim. Because as stated by Bruce, it was finally time for him to learn how to drive the Batmobile. However, the first step to driving the Batmobile was knowing how to drive a stick shift, so unfortunately he wasn't gonna start with the Batmobile. Instead, he'd be starting off slow and building his foundation inside of an old orange truck so he could get the basics down first. After that, our story jumps over to present day Gotham though, with three armed criminals stopping a truck driver from continuing his route by blocking the road with an old sedan. So he tried telling them to get out of the way because he needed to unload his shipment by 4 o'clock, but it wasn't long before he was forced to exit the vehicle when one of them whipped out a sidearm, urging him to flee the scene. But as one of the accomplices sifted through the product as fast as they possibly could, the truck driver decided that he wasn't going to follow their orders and refused to cooperate.